Dracula. Few figures are so well known and strike as much terror as that of the vampire known as Dracula. This creature, not yet dead but no longer alive, has at one time or another tempted, fascinated, and repelled us all.
I think what makes Dracula such a compelling character is that he combines both sex and horror. He can kill you or turn you into a replica of himself, a vampire. Sexually, he seems to always prey on beautiful young women. He drinks their blood. He turns them into objects of his desire who cannot resist his desire. This makes him, in a strange way, a model for many men. We've all got a little bit of that.
For some people, the vampire is a kind of statement. It's a rebellious statement. It's the last thing you bring home to mother.
When writer Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897, he couldn't have predicted that he was creating a figure who was larger than death.
One of the reasons the vampire is so popular is because it mixes three very powerful things together. The search for immortality, the need for power, and sexuality.
We associate Dracula with Bram Stoker in the 19th century, but I think the character is timeless.
Today he might be timeless, but in the 15th century, he was all too real. His name was Prince Vlad Dracula, whom history has come to know as Vlad the Impaler.
There's actually a woodcut illustrating how Vlad would sit down and have his lunch while hundreds of victims would be writhing on wooden stakes in the background.
In many ways, the reality of Vlad Dracula's life was more terrifying than the fiction he helped inspire. His story more shocking than anything Hollywood could manufacture.
Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own free will.
The snow-capped Carpathian Mountains, rising to a height of over 8,000 feet, sliced through Eastern Europe like a knife blade. In the 15th century, this mountain range helped form the border of three principalities that would ultimately make up modern Romania: Transylvania, Moldavia, and Wallachia. At one time, each of these states was governed by a ruling family. Beginning in 1448, Vlad Dracula reigned over Wallachia.
Vlad is his given name. Dracula is the name he inherits from his father because he, like his father, was a member of the Order of the Dracul, the Order of the Dragon. And Dracula is a diminutive form of Dracul.
It was a term of honor. It meant he was part of this order that was dedicated to defending Christian Europe from the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman Empire, from a small Turkish state in the 13th century, had rapidly and often violently grown into one of the most powerful domains in the world. Vlad Dracula was one of the few to successfully keep the Ottomans at bay.
Vlad gets to be known as a kind of a George Washington figure for the Romanian people, primarily for his role in establishing the core, the initial entity that will later become Romania.
While his people might have admired and respected him, Dracula terrified his enemies.
Romania was the only country in southeastern Europe that was never made into a Turkish province. And Dracula's campaign and his terror tactics were partially instrumental in that. He was a kind of law and order man.
He doesn't invent, but he really perfects the use of stakes to impale people upon as a means of a torturous death. Essentially, a wooden pole is stuck in the ground and the top of it cut to a fine point, and one is shoved down on it. It's not fatal at the beginning, so one can be left stuck on this pole for as much as 24 hours or more before one dies a very painful death.
There were a number of stories about Vlad. He used impalement not only against the Ottomans in battle, but he also used it in local situations against people who were considered to be a threat to the state. People who were supporting rival claimants to the throne, or people who were committing acts of thievery or adultery.
It was said that Dracula determined the height of a victim's stake by their position in society. The higher the rank, the higher the pole. Witnesses reported that forests of decaying corpses were sometimes left out in the open for months. And there is testimony that, over the course of his reign, Dracula impaled thousands. His obsession led to early infamy and cemented his status as a barbarian. German pamphlets describing Vlad the Impaler's atrocities circulated throughout Eastern Europe.
They began writing pamphlets in the 1500s, criticizing Dracula and, in fact, exaggerating his misdeeds. Much of the negative aspects of Dracula are owed to these German pamphlets.
These pamphlets were really popular, and they were just lapped up. They were the horror stories of the day. We don't know whether he would have the reputation he had at all, had it not been for these pamphlets.
The first bestseller was a Bible, of course. The second bestseller was Vlad.
Still, with the passing of the centuries, even in Romania, Prince Vlad Dracula's brutal reign was relegated to the cobwebs of history. But that changed in the 1890s, when an Irish drama critic and sometime author happened on Vlad Dracula's story while researching a Gothic novel. His name was Bram Stoker, and though the tale Stoker told was new, his subject was ancient: vampires.
The word vampire had its origins in folklore. It's a corpse, a reanimated corpse that comes back from the grave to feed upon the blood of the living in order to sustain its existence.
A vampire's ravenous appetite for blood is one of its most distinguishing characteristics.
Blood is the force of life. It's kind of universal symbol for life, period, as well as for death. That's what gives a vampire immortality.
For centuries, the myth of the vampire had helped explain the unexplainable. Over those centuries, a wealth of legend and superstition had been passed down from generation to generation.
The vampire serves two very different needs in different cultures: problems of birth and problems of death. The vampire originates to explain crib death. The diagnosis was you had a very healthy baby, and the next morning you woke up and found the baby dead, as if the blood had all been drained away. There was no color left. Then later on, if a person had an unusual death, an accidental death, these were people who were destined to become vampires.
Somebody were buried alive, for example, which frequently happened, and managed to come to and claw his way out, and would show up in the village with blood-stained fingernails and so on. The villagers would add two and two together and come up with what they assumed was four. Oh, this is a vampire. We've always heard our grandparents talk about vampires. Well, here's one. So they would chase him back to the cemetery and drive a stake through his heart and take care of him once and for all.
The concept was to pin them in the ground. And a preventative to vampirism, if you suspected this person might not lie quietly in the grave, was to bury them face down, so if they started digging out, they'd just dig the wrong way. There's the belief that was quite common in one form or another that the vampires are obsessive compulsive. If you scatter seeds or grains or something of the sort on the ground, the vampire is compelled to count every single one, and that's how you can trap them outside their coffin long enough to kill them.
At the end of the 18th century, the legend of the vampire filtered into Western Europe, and there it encountered the Romantic movement in literature. The Romantics were soon captivated by the vampire myth.
The vampire was no longer a creature of folklore, it was now a creature of modern French and English and German literature. And there it was completely transformed.
The vampire in folklore tended to be dirty, scroungy peasant, digging his way out of the grave, shambling around, frightening his neighbors, and feeding on those that had been close to him in life. Whereas the first vampire story in English, for example, was about a predatory aristocrat.
But the vampire that author Bram Stoker conjured up was based on more than myth. Stoker had stumbled across the chronicle of a man, Prince Vlad Dracula.
Bram Stoker happened to be in the town of Whitby in northeastern England for a summer vacation. And he happened to go to the local library and pick down this history of Romania. And in this book, there was a short piece about a 15th century ruler named Dracula.
As Stoker read on, he discovered a sinister meaning to the word Dracula.
He liked the name. He mentions in his notes at least twice, Dracula means devil.
He waited till the last minute to change the name of his novel from what was going to be Lord Vampire to Dracula. He knew that Dracula had lived in Transylvania at some point. He knew that the real Dracula had fought the Turks, but that was about it.
So from all the evidence that is now available, he doesn't seem to have known very much about Vlad's life.
But he knew enough. After 7 years of research, Stoker published his tale in 1897. In it, he described the voracious life and gruesome and long overdue death of Dracula, a count from Transylvania.
Count Dracula decides that his homeland is worn out, used up, and he wants to go conquer new worlds. He wants to go to the teeming city of London, the greatest city in the world.
To help purchase an English estate, Count Dracula summons Jonathan Harker, an unsuspecting attorney, to his castle in Transylvania. With Harker held prisoner, Count Dracula travels to the English countryside, where he seduces both Harker's fiancée Mina and her best friend Lucy.
So the rest of the story then is basically how Dracula victimizes these two women, and then how the men in the story band together under the leadership of Abraham Van Helsing, who becomes sort of the chief vampire hunter. And the band of vampire hunters track Dracula back to Transylvania, back to his castle, and they dispatch of him once and for all, or so we think.
In terms of what could be published at the time that Dracula was written, it was about as sexy a novel as you could have. Here is this character coming from the boundaries of civilization, attacking women, attacks their neck, kind of a form of oral sex, and drains the life from them.
One of the things that scholars have been most fascinated about with Stoker's novel is the degree to which he was aware of the encoded sexuality, because there's no doubt it's there. You know, anything that bites and sucks has obviously got sexual undertones.
Despite those salacious undertones, Stoker's book failed to find an audience.
When Dracula was first published in 1897, it was by no means an immediate sensation. It had average sales, it had average reviews. Most of them were sort of, oh, it's a good horror story. Nobody read any, literary significance into it. Nobody attempted to interpret it in any way. It was a good horror story and nothing more.
Bram Stoker died in 1912. And like the historical Vlad Dracula, it looked like both Stoker and his novel were destined to be forgotten. But 25 years after Dracula was published, the story found new life, a life in the moving pictures. In 1922, a German, Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, directed the film The Plague Carrier, or Nosferatu. It was a marriage made in heaven and hell.
What Nosferatu did was an attempt to present Dracula in all of his evilness. He's portrayed as a rat-like creature who hangs out with other rats. He's taken on such a grotesque appearance that he could not walk the streets without being pointed out.
The 1922 Nosferatu, the German film, was, I believe, one of the most brilliant horror films ever made. people had never seen a film like that, particularly the visual images, the composition of the frame, the way in which Dracula moved, the sometimes profile of Dracula, sometimes a shadow moving across the screen, and the fact that he had come from the unknown, mysterious Eastern Europe at that time made him the evil alien figure.
In a 1931 movie, Hollywood gave Dracula a voice.
I am Dracula.
Universal Pictures hired a little-known Hungarian actor named Bela Lugosi to portray Dracula.
Lugosi plays Dracula as a drawing room character. He's someone you'd meet at the opera. He has the cape. So Lugosi as the aristocrat, still evil, but in a way very charming and very dapper.
I bid you welcome.
In the 1931 movie with Lugosi, if you go back and look at it today, there are two things you will notice. One is Lugosi has no fangs, and he is never shown in a biting scene. Those were just not things that you could do in 1931.
More Wolfbane, more effective than Wolfbane, Count. Indeed.
It's really that 1931 script that turns Dracula into a world character and creates the kind of love for the vampire that we've had ever since. Dracula enters a level of popular consciousness that it never had, and we probably wouldn't know much about Dracula now if it hadn't been for that movie. The movie then spawned sequels, and Lugosi then becomes kind of the image of what a vampire is.
The death of Lugosi in 1956 didn't dampen the public's unquenchable thirst for more Dracula. Hammer Films hired classically trained Christopher Lee to put on Dracula's cape. Unlike Lugosi, Lee was able to put some bite into the role.
Christopher Lee is the first Dracula who turns and opens his mouth and shows his fangs and hisses at the audience.
You have to get into the late 60s, starting probably in television with a series called Dark Shadows, where the vampire suddenly takes on a little bit more of something you could identify with a bit. There was a little motivation behind the vampire. He couldn't help what he was, poor thing, that sort of thing.
In a picture called Dracula Rising, I use Dracula as a young priest who is torn between God and the devil, and turned but fought against it. He fights against his ultimate fate. So for me, the conflict was really within Dracula himself.
We saw a rise in interest in vampires at the end of the 80s, and it carried us into the 90s. And we thought that this was going to peak in 97 with the centennial of Dracula. And then Buffy happened, and Buffy became quite the phenomenon.
Who are you?
I am Dracula.
Get out!
Buffy the Vampire Slayer tapped into sort of the teenage scene. When it started, the vampires were evil creatures. But after a while, you got sympathetic vampires in Buffy, and the clash, if you wish, between the horrible vampire of Stoker and the more sympathetic vampire of the 20th century.
I can see Dracula in outer space, or a symbol of Dracula, of a race from some other planet, some other solar system or galaxy. He can be placed in just about any age and in any guise.
A far more benign Dracula has even become a regular on the television program Sesame Street. There, he helps to teach children how to count. Since his invention in 1897, Dracula and his vampire offspring have become an ominous and constant presence in our culture. They've appeared in thousands of films, hundreds of books, on television, in advertising, and as a ubiquitous costume on Halloween.
He's even in the universities. Many universities now include Dracula, the novel, on some of their courses. There's a lot of scholarship on Dracula. Literary critics have tackled the novel and interpreted it from a variety of perspectives.
The vampire has become a model for some of our major social diseases and the various kinds of addictions that we have. The vampire has become a representation of AIDS and other kinds of blood diseases. At the same time, the vampire has become a symbol of forbidden love. The vampire is a person that we see on the sly.
It's quite remarkable because most of the monsters don't have that same appeal. And I think it's because vampires become whatever a particular writer or a particular period in history wants them to be. They're shapeshifters, and they've managed to adapt, or the culture has managed to adapt the vampire to it.
As Dracula has found legitimacy, scholars have resurrected his namesake, Prince Vlad Dracula, from the grave.
By tying the character Dracula down to a historical figure, they actually made it respectable to study this novel and to look at it in terms of the historic past, much more than just Gothic literature.
I think Romanian history, thanks to Stoker, has introduced Vlad in the Encyclopedia of the World. I think that's quite an achievement, because all these princes, I mean, there are countless princes who did more or less what Dracula did. He alone is the one that survives as an international figure.
I think Vlad would be somewhat amazed, but at the same time would think it only rightful that a man as great as he should be as well known as he now is.
A character like Dracula, for many people, allows them to access, albeit briefly and vicariously, the darker side of human nature. You can dabble with it, knowing that you can close the book, you can turn off the movie, you can walk away from it. You don't have to give yourself to it. But you can have just that brief experience of actually playing with the devil and then walking away.
Within stood a tall old man, clad in black from head to foot, without a single speck of color about him anywhere. He held in his hand an antique silver lamp in which the flame burned without a chimney or globe of any kind. The old man motioned me in with his right hand with a courtly gesture, saying in excellent English, but with a strange intonation, "Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own free will."